Marrying a plumber. How embarrassing. Those were my mother's exact words dripping through the phone line like acid. My father didn't even bother to speak, he just hung up. My sister Savannah laughed so loud I could almost hear her champagne glass clink against her teeth. Who'd be caught dead at that wedding, she said. They didn't just disapprove, they boycotted. Not one call, not one message, not even a single RSVP card with their names on it. I walked down that aisle alone. No father on my arm, no mother crying with pride, just silence where love should have been. But what they didn't know was that the man they mocked, the man in the blue work shirt and calloused hands, would soon be on every major news network in America. And when his face hit that screen, I had 110 missed calls from the very people who said I was a disgrace. Now let me take you back to how it all began. The night I called my parents to tell them about my wedding, the Charleston sky was dark and heavy with rain. I had spent the entire day sealing envelopes, hand-addressing invitations, and carefully pressing each golden wax seal with my initials EW, as if that tiny ritual could keep the hope from slipping out of my chest. I thought, maybe, just maybe, if I extended one more olive branch, they'd meet me halfway. The Whitmores were old Charleston money, the kind of family whose name appeared in newspapers under philanthropy and society. My father, Charles, ran a shipping and logistics company that had been in the family for 3 generations. My mother, Beatrice, chaired every charity gala within 50 miles and believed reputation was a living thing, something fragile to be fed and protected. And then there was Savannah, my younger sister, the darling of Charleston's high society, beautiful, confident, and completely adored. I used to think our home was perfect, the manicured hedges, the marble foyer, the endless silverware polished every Sunday. But as I grew older, I realized perfection is just silence dressed up in pearls. No one raised their voice at the Whitmore house, not out of peace but out of fear. Every dinner felt like an interview I wasn't qualified for. When I met Luke Harris 2 years ago, he didn't care that my family name carried weight. He didn't even know who the Whitmores were. He just smiled, that easy, honest smile of his, and asked if I wanted coffee. He had strong hands, the kind that told stories of work, not wealth. I remember thinking how rare that felt, to meet someone who built things instead of merely buying them. That night, sitting alone in my apartment, I dialed my parents' number. My hand trembled slightly as I listened to the ringing. 3 rings. Then 4. Finally, my mother's voice came through, clipped and cold. "Eleanor," she said, like she was answering a call from the dry cleaner. "Hi, Mom," I said softly. "I wanted to call and let you know the wedding's in 3 weeks. I really hope you and Dad can come." There was a pause long enough to make my stomach tighten. 3 weeks, she repeated. "And you're really going through with this?" "Plumber, his name's Luke," I replied, my voice firmer than I felt. "And yes, I'm marrying him." A low, almost elegant scoff came through the line. "Honestly, Eleanor, how do you expect us to show our faces after this? A Whitmore marrying a tradesman, you're dragging our name through the mud." "Luke is a good man," I said quietly. "He's kind, he's smart, and he loves me. I'm sure he fixes pipes beautifully," she said, her words sugar-coated with disdain. In the background, I heard Savannah's laugh, bright, cruel, unmistakable. "Oh my God," she said loudly enough to make sure I heard. "Who'd be caught dead at that wedding?" "Tell her congratulations, Mom. She's officially the town joke." "Savannah," I whispered under my breath, but my mother spoke over me. "You've made your choice, Eleanor," she said. "Don't expect us to stand by it." And then the line went dead. For a long time, I just sat there, phone still in hand, staring at the rain sliding down my window. The echo of their words filled the silence like static. I should have cried, but I didn't. I felt something colder instead. It was the same chill I'd felt at every Whitmore dinner table, the kind that came from knowing love in our house had terms and conditions. On the counter sat a stack of wedding invitations, 25 in total. I reached for the one addressed to my parents, ran my finger over the embossed letters, and then quietly tore it in half. It wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of surrender. I couldn't force people to show up for me anymore. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at my reflection in the kitchen window. The woman looking back didn't seem fragile. She looked tired, yes, but underneath that there was something steadier, something beginning to harden. Maybe it was resolve. I thought of Luke's voice earlier that day when I told him I was nervous about making the call. He had smiled, setting down his wrench. "People show you who they are, Ellie," he'd said. "Believe them, but don't let it change who you are." He never made promises he couldn't keep. He never tried to fix what wasn't broken. And somehow, that made me trust him even more. Still, as the clock ticked past midnight, I couldn't shake the ache. Not because I needed my family's approval, but because I had spent 33 years trying to earn it. Every grade, every promotion, every perfectly pressed dress, it had all been one long audition for love that never came. I went to bed that night with a strange calm in my chest. The kind that comes when there's nothing left to lose. Outside, thunder rolled across the Charleston harbor, and the sound reminded me of clinking silverware at our family dinners. Loud, polished, but hollow. Somewhere deep down, I think I already knew that my wedding day would be different, that the aisle I'd walk wouldn't just lead to Luke. It would lead away from the Whitmores, from their polished lies, from everything that had kept me small. I pressed my hand over the last unsealed envelope on the table, the one addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Charles Whitmore, and whispered the truth out loud for the first time. They won't come. And I was right. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that the very same people who laughed at my marriage would one day beg to be seen in the same room as the man they called just a plumber. That before it was all over, the Whitmore name would crumble while ours rose. I looked out at the rain-soaked city lights, took a deep breath, and turned off the lamp. "I thought I had lost everything that night," I whispered to the darkness, "but sometimes losing your family is how you finally find yourself." In Charleston, names carried more weight than truth, and no name was heavier than Whitmore. The morning after that phone call, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against my window and the faint echo of my mother's voice still in my head. The same 4 words, marrying a plumber, Eleanor, looped through my mind like a curse disguised as a question. I made coffee, opened the newspaper, and there they were. My parents smiling under chandeliers, shaking hands with senators at another charity gala. The headline read, "The Whitmores host annual fundraiser for coastal preservation." My mother's pearl necklace glistened under the flash of cameras. My father's arm rested casually on her back. The caption below said, "Symbols of Southern grace." I stared at it for a long time. They were symbols all right, just not of grace. When I was a child, Whitmore Hall had been my whole world. A sprawling Georgian mansion surrounded by magnolia trees, with a fountain that never stopped singing, and windows tall enough to let in the moonlight. Inside, everything gleamed crystal silver marble, but it was the kind of shine that could blind you. We didn't raise our voices in that house. We polished them. We didn't argue. We curated opinions. At dinner, my mother corrected posture with the same tone she used to compliment the governor's wife. My father would talk about markets and mergers. Savannah would tell stories about her designer internships, and I mostly listened. The air smelled of lilies and distance. My mother used to say, "We don't air our laundry, dear. We press it." It sounded charming to guests, but to us it was gospel. Everything had to look perfect, no matter how hollow it felt. When father had an affair with a board member's wife years ago, mother didn't cry. She just smiled tighter, scheduled another luncheon, and said, "Appearances are everything, Eleanor." That was the day I learned that silence was currency. If you wanted to survive as a Whitmore, you paid with composure. Savannah thrived in that world. From the moment she could walk, she twirled through garden parties like she'd been born under a spotlight. She was radiant and loud, the perfect reflection of my mother's ambition. At 16, she got a convertible for making cheer captain. When I graduated valedictorian from the academy, I got a planner and a polite smile. "You're the sensible one, darling," my mother said. "Savannah shines you steady." It was supposed to be a compliment, but I heard what she meant. Savannah was to be admired. I was to be tolerated. For years, I tried to earn what they withheld. I went to college in Boston on scholarship, graduated top of my class, took a job in finance, paid every bill myself. I thought maybe success, my kind of quiet, hard-earned success, would make them see me differently. It didn't. At family holidays, my accomplishments were background noise to Savannah's newest adventures. She'd arrive in glittering dresses, all perfume and laughter, bragging about rooftop parties, and the new man in her life, Parker, a financial prodigy from Atlanta. My mother would beam, my father would nod approvingly, and I would sit there, invisible, at my own family table. But invisibility, I would later realize, is a kind of training. It teaches you how to observe what others miss. You start to notice the cracks beneath perfection, the way my father's voice hardened when the markets dropped, the way my mother's eyes darted when someone mentioned charity, audits, the way Savannah copied her gestures like a student afraid of failing class. We were a family built on choreography, every movement rehearsed, every smile measured. After I moved into my own apartment downtown, I stopped visiting Whitmore Hall as often. I told myself it was because of work, but really it was self-preservation. The house looked the same, but something in me didn't fit anymore. The long dining table felt colder, the laughter thinner. I had started craving something my parents couldn't offer: authenticity, even if it came with imperfection. Sometimes, though, the old longing crept back. On late nights, I'd catch a glimpse of their estate from the highway, the iron gates glowing under floodlights, the windows lit like lanterns, and I'd wonder what it felt like to belong without earning it. I'd press my palm to the steering wheel and whisper to myself, "One day you'll stop needing them." Then came the call about Sunday dinner. My mother's tone had been clipped, rehearsed, like she was checking a box. "Bring your friend," she said when I mentioned Luke. I hung up and sat in silence, the phone still warm in my hand. Part of me hoped she'd changed, that maybe after everything she'd see me as more than a liability to her image. I was wrong. The days leading up to that dinner, the past replayed in fragments. I remembered the Christmas Eve when Savannah got diamond earrings and I got a fountain pen for work. I remembered the night I overheard my parents whispering that I was too serious to attract the right kind of man. I remembered my mother telling a neighbor that she worried I'd settle beneath my station. She said it with a laugh, of course. Always with a laugh. By 28, I'd stopped laughing back. I built a life that was mine alone. No chauffeurs, no cocktail parties, no polite lies. My apartment was small, but filled with warmth, thrifted art, hand-me-down furniture, and the soft hum of independence. I learned to fix my own leaks, balance my own accounts, and carry my own groceries. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and yet even honesty can feel lonely. One evening after a long day at the firm, I returned home to find a flicker of something familiar, the ache of wanting someone to come home to. That was before Luke. Before the burst pipe that changed everything. But that's getting ahead of myself. Back then, all I knew was that I was tired. Tired of performing, tired of earning affection like a paycheck, tired of being invisible in rooms I helped keep spotless. So I began writing at night. Nothing fancy, just thoughts on lined paper, things I'd never say out loud. On the first page, I wrote a promise to myself: I will not become them. On the second, I wrote a list titled Things I'll Teach My Children. At the top, love is not a transaction. Respect is not a reward. Sometimes I wondered if my parents were even capable of love beyond utility. Maybe for them affection was just another form of control, a way to mold, to measure, to manage. And maybe that's why deep down I always gravitated toward people who didn't demand perfection. It was around that time that I started noticing how the world outside their marble walls worked differently. In the office, cafeteria janitors joked with executives like equals. At the local market, an elderly couple argued over tomatoes, laughing in the end. No masks, no performances, no curated charm, just life in its raw, imperfect form. It was messy and beautiful. It made me wonder what I'd been missing all those years. The day the pipe burst in my kitchen, I didn't know it was the universe handing me the answer. I just knew water was everywhere, soaking the floor, running toward the bedroom carpet. I panicked, called the first emergency service I could find. 45 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Reed Plumbing, a warm male voice called out. When I opened it, a tall man stood there, broad-shouldered, wearing a navy shirt with a faded logo, hair damp from the drizzle. His hands were rough, his eyes kind. "Ma'am," he said with a small grin, "looks like your kitchen's staging a rebellion." I laughed before I could stop myself, and for the first time in a long while the sound didn't feel forced. I didn't know it then, but the man holding that wrench was about to rewrite everything I believed about class, love, and worth. The first thing I noticed about him wasn't the wrench or the uniform, it was the calm. Most repairmen who came to my apartment seemed rushed or irritated, but this one moved as if time was his ally. When he stepped inside, a few raindrops fell from his hair onto the tile. His shirt, dark navy with a patch that read Reed Plumbing and Heating, clung to his shoulders. His voice was steady, almost kind. "Show me where the rebellion's happening," he said with a grin. I led him to the kitchen. Water still trickled from under the sink and the floor glistened with puddles. He crouched down, turned the valve, and the chaos stopped. "Looks like an old copper joint gave up," he said. His tone wasn't frustrated, just factual, as if even broken things deserved patience. I found myself watching him. He didn't grunt or curse under his breath. He hummed. A quiet, tuneless hum that made the small kitchen feel oddly peaceful. The metallic sound of his tools clinking, the rhythmic twist of a wrench, it was like music. When he stood wiping his hands with a rag, I caught a glimpse of his forearms, scarred and strong. "You're all set for now," he said, smiling. "But I'd get these pipes replaced soon. They've seen better decades." "Thank you," I replied. "You make it sound like an emergency waiting to happen." He chuckled, packing up his toolbox. "Plumbing's like trust. Once a leak starts, it doesn't fix itself." The words hit harder than I expected. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. "That's an interesting way to put it." He shrugged lightly. "Guess I've seen enough people ignore small problems until the whole wall collapses." Something in me understood that. Before he left, I asked, "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." He hesitated, polite but unsure. "If it's not too much trouble." I poured 2 cups, sliding one toward him at the small kitchen table. He wrapped his calloused hands around the mug, the steam rising between us like a quiet truce. "So, how long have you been in the plumbing business?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "My dad started it 30 years ago," he said. "I took over when he passed. Been running it about 4 years now." "I'm sorry," I said softly. He nodded. "Thanks, he loved it though. Said fixing things kept him grounded." I smiled. "Seems like it worked for you too." He looked down, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe. What about you? What do you do when you're not rescuing your kitchen from disaster?" "I'm a financial advisor," I said. "I fix other people's mistakes too, just with money instead of pipes." He laughed, a warm, unguarded sound. "So we both deal with leaks then." I laughed back. The sound surprised me how easy it felt. When he finished his coffee, he stood and reached for his jacket. "You ever need help again, call me. But hopefully you won't." He left a small receipt on the counter, his handwriting looping neatly across the paper. "If it leaks again, don't panic, call Luke." Luke. The name suited him, steady, grounded, impossible to forget. That night after he left, I found myself glancing at the receipt more than once. I told myself it was just gratitude. But deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. A few days later, he came back. The pipes were fine, but he said he was checking the water heater just to be safe. I didn't believe him, and he didn't try too hard to make me. He brought coffee this time. "Truce offering," he said, holding up 2 cups. We sat again at the little table. He told me about growing up in North Charleston, about his father, teaching him how to listen for the sound of pressure in a pipe. "If you pay attention," he said, "water tells you what's wrong." You just have to listen. He asked about my work. I told him about long hours, tight deadlines, clients who measured worth in numbers. He nodded. I guess people trust you with their savings the way they trust me with their leaks. Except when something breaks, I said. Then they stop trusting anyone. His eyes softened. Then maybe they trusted the wrong thing to begin with. There was something disarming about the way he spoke, not clever, not performative, just real. He didn't seem to care how he sounded, and maybe that was what made every word stay. After that day, he started showing up in small, almost accidental ways. A text to check if the pipes were still fine, a knock on the door with an excuse about a quick follow-up. Once he helped me carry groceries upstairs when my hands were full. Each encounter chipped away at the wall I'd spent years building around myself. One Sunday, he showed up without his uniform. Jeans, a gray shirt, a few wild curls falling over his forehead. I was in the neighborhood, he said, slightly shy. You mentioned you liked the park by the river. Want a walk? I hesitated. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. Appearances are everything. But then I thought of the peace in his eyes, the way he never asked me to perform. Sure, I said. We walked through Battery Park under the shade of oak trees. The air smelled of salt and jasmine. He carried 2 cups of sweet tea, one for me, one for himself. He told me about his mother, who still lived in a small house with creaky floors. She says creaks are the soul of a home, means it's lived enough to have stories. That's beautiful, I said. I grew up in a house where silence meant survival. He looked at me carefully but didn't push. Well, he said after a pause, I hope you find one that creaks someday. We stopped near the railing overlooking the river. The water shimmered under the afternoon light. He took something from his bag, a small wooden chessboard. Play, I raised a brow. You play chess, he nodded. My dad taught me, said it's good for patience. We sat on a bench, the board between us, the soft hum of waves nearby. I hadn't played in years, but the rhythm came back. Quickly move, counter, retreat, risk. Halfway through the game, he said, you think too much before you move. It's called strategy, I teased. It's called fear, he countered gently. I looked up, half smiling, half defensive. And what are you, fearless? He moved his rook, just not scared of losing things that never belonged to me. For the rest of the game, I couldn't stop thinking about that. By the time the sun dipped low, we were both laughing, our unfinished chess match forgotten. We walked back slowly, not in a rush to reach any end. When we reached my door, he said, Thanks for the company. I needed that, so did I. After he left, I realized the house didn't feel as empty as it used to. It wasn't the kind of fullness you get from noise or decoration, it was quieter, deeper. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a rhythm. Morning texts, quick coffee breaks, little conversations that stretched longer each time. I told him about my mother's obsession with status, my father's silence, Savannah's perfect smile. He never judged, never offered pity, just listened. One night as we sat watching the city lights from my balcony, he asked softly, Does your family know about me? The question made my chest tighten. Not really, I said after a pause. They know there's someone, just not who. Because of what I do, he asked, eyes still on the skyline. I hesitated. They wouldn't understand. They measure people by things that don't matter. He nodded slowly. And how do you measure them? I didn't answer. Maybe because I already knew the truth by the same standards they taught me to hate. He didn't push. He just smiled. It's okay, Eleanor. You don't owe them the version of you that makes them comfortable. I turned to look at him. You make things sound simple. Things are simple, he said. People just like making them complicated. I laughed softly. Spoken like a man who's never been to a Whitmore dinner. He chuckled, shaking his head. Guess I'll have to take your word for it. The moment hung there between us, light but heavy, like a truth, not ready to be spoken aloud. When he left that night, I watched him disappear down the street, the glow from streetlights catching the curve of his shoulders. The city felt quieter again, but not in the way it used to. I closed the door, leaned against it, and whispered to myself, He's just a plumber. But even then I knew I was lying. The invitation had been my idea. but the nerves were all his. Luke stood in front of my bathroom mirror, tightening his tie with the focus of a man about to face trial. "You don't have to do this," I told him softly. "I do," he said. "You said they matter to you, and if they matter to you, then I'll meet them." I wanted to believe him, but the knot in my stomach said otherwise. For 2 weeks I'd been dreading this dinner. My parents' sudden warmth on the phone had felt unnatural. My mother's voice, overly sweet, had a rehearsed edge to it. "Bring your friend," she had said, like Luke was a +1 to a charity gala, instead of the man I loved. The night air was thick with humidity as we drove toward Whitmore Hall. Luke's old pickup truck looked painfully out of place among the Bentleys and Jaguars that lined the circular driveway. When we stopped at the gates, the house glowed like a cathedral, its white columns bathed in gold light. I stared at it, remembering the countless nights I'd walked up those steps in silence, my heels echoing like guilt. Luke looked at me and smiled, that quiet, unshakable calm in his eyes. "Your family's impressive," he said. "They're loud," I replied, forcing a smile. "That's not the same thing." A valet in a pressed uniform appeared, his eyes flicking briefly to the truck before offering a polite, practiced smile. Inside, everything was the same: the scent of lilies, the clink of glass, the way the air seemed heavier here. My mother greeted us at the door, her smile frozen in place. "Eleanor," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. Then her eyes shifted to Luke. "And this must be Mr. Harris. So nice of you to join us." Her tone was civil, but the pause between words carried centuries of judgment. My father appeared next, straight-backed, silver-haired expression unreadable. "Luke," he said, shaking hands briefly. "Plumbing, isn't it? Always good to see people working with their hands." Luke's smile didn't waver. "Yes, sir. Keeps me grounded." "Indeed," my father murmured, as if the concept were foreign. Savannah swept into the room moments later, wrapped in silk, the color of champagne perfume, arriving before she did. "Oh my God," she said, looking Luke up and down. "So you're the famous plumber. I've never met one in person." Luke grinned. "Guess tonight's your lucky night." Her laugh was sharp, the kind that cut instead of charmed. "Touché." Dinner was served in the grand dining room beneath the chandelier I'd once feared would fall on me during endless family meals. The table was set with gold-rimmed plates, crystal glasses, and enough silverware to build a small ship. Luke sat beside me, posture relaxed, while my parents assumed their thrones at the head of the table. The first course arrived, something delicate with truffle foam, and my father launched into a monologue about the economy. "It's all about control," he said, gesturing with his fork. "Real power is knowing when to tighten the flow and when to release it." I caught Luke's glance, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Sounds like plumbing, actually," he said. "Too much pressure, everything bursts." My mother's smile twitched. "Yes, I imagine it's similar," she said dryly. "Though, of course, with slightly different stakes." Savannah leaned forward. "So, Luke, tell us about your work. Do you like crawl under houses and fix things yourself?" "Sometimes," he said simply. "Wow," she replied, turning to me. "I can't even imagine. You always did like fixing broken things, didn't you, Ellie?" I felt heat crawl up my neck. "Some things are worth fixing," I said. For a moment, silence. Then my father cleared his throat. "Tell me, Luke, do you have plans for retirement? Surely the work must be taxing on the body." Luke set his fork down, met my father's gaze. "I've built the company to run without me eventually. I believe in teaching people to manage what they've built, not just own it." "Pragmatic," my father said. "I respect that." But his eyes said otherwise. The rest of dinner was a balancing act, every sentence weighed, every smile a negotiation. My mother talked about her foundation's latest gala, dropping names like pearls. Savannah bragged about Parker's latest business trip to Paris. Luke listened politely, never defensive, never out of place, even when they tried to make him feel small. His calm was unshakable, and somehow that made their cruelty look smaller. When dessert came, my mother's mask slipped. "Eleanor," she said, dabbing her lips with a napkin, "you do realize this." Relationship may not fit the life you were raised for. I looked at her, voice steady. And what life is that, mother? The one where we pretend love is a performance. Savannah rolled her eyes. Don't get dramatic. Luke reached for my hand under the table, a quiet anchor. It's okay, he murmured. No, I said louder than I meant to. It's not okay. You've all made it clear what you think of him, but here's what I think. He's the kindest, most honest man I've ever met, and he doesn't need your approval any more than I do. The words landed like glass breaking. My mother's fork froze midair. My father's expression hardened. Savannah let out a soft laugh. You really are serious, aren't you? I am, I said. Luke squeezed my hand once, a silent plea to let it go, but something inside me had already broken free. My mother stood, her voice sharp. Eleanor, that's enough. You're embarrassing yourself. I stood too. No, mother. I've been embarrassed for years, by the way we measure people by their wallets, by how we mistake arrogance for class. For a long moment, no one moved. The chandelier hummed faintly overhead. Then Luke rose, his tone gentle but firm. Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Whitmore. We'll be going now. My father gave a curt nod. Of course. Don't let us keep you. Outside, the air smelled like rain. We walked in silence to the truck. I could still feel my mother's perfume clinging to my skin like a ghost. Luke opened the passenger door for me, but I paused, staring back at the glowing house. Behind those windows I'd once thought I'd find pride. All I'd ever found was judgment. As we drove away, the silence stretched. Finally, I said, I'm sorry you had to go through that. He kept his eyes on the road. I didn't expect anything different. You deserved better, he smiled faintly. You don't have to defend me, Ellie. They don't have to understand me. They don't even have to like me. But it's not fair, I said, voice trembling. They treated you like what? He interrupted gently. Like a man who fixes leaks for a living. That's what I am. No, I said. You're more than that. He glanced at me, the corners of his mouth lifting. You know what I see when I look at them? People terrified of getting their hands dirty. You can't build anything real that way. I didn't respond. I just looked out the window at the dark road, at the lights blurring through the rain. He reached over, took my hand again. Eleanor, he said quietly, you're not them. Don't let them make you believe you are. I turned to him, tears prickling behind my eyes. Do you really think we'll be okay? He nodded, thumb brushing my knuckles. We already are. When we pulled up outside my apartment, I didn't get out right away. The world felt heavier but also clearer. Luke leaned back in his seat, looking up at the sky. Funny thing about storms, he said. They clean everything they touch. I followed his gaze. The clouds had started to break, letting thin strands of moonlight slip through. For the first time, the night didn't feel suffocating. He turned to me, smiling softly. They don't know what they're missing. I smiled back, the ache in my chest softening. No, I said. They don't. As he started the engine again, I looked once more toward the distant glow of Whitmore Hall. In that shining house, the family I'd once begged for acceptance was now a shadow of its own reflection. And beside me sat a man whose worth they'd never understand, a man who without saying a word had taught me what grace really looked like. That night, as rain traced silver lines across the windshield, I realized something I should have known all along. Love doesn't need chandeliers to shine. It just needs truth strong enough to survive the dark. The morning of my wedding broke quietly, with a pale mist drifting through the trees outside the cottage I had rented near the garden venue. I woke before the alarm, long before anyone else would arrive. The air smelled of dew and lavender, the kind of stillness that comes before something sacred or irreversible. My gown hung by the window, ivory chiffons, simple and light, a soft line of lace along the hem. No embellishments, no train that needed tending. I wanted it that way. I had spent too many years being weighed down by other people's expectations. Lydia arrived just after sunrise, holding a bag of bagels in one hand and her camera in the other. She had been my friend since college, the kind who knew when to talk and when to simply stand beside me. You slept it all, she asked, setting the bag on the counter. Barely, I said, smiling faintly. It feels strange. I'm calm, but my hands won't stop shaking. She poured me tea and sat beside me. That's not nerves, Ellie. That's your heart finally catching up to your courage. Her words made me laugh softly. I stared out the window at the garden below. Chairs were being set in tidy rows, ribbons tied wildflowers arranged into glass jars, and yet there was an emptiness woven through the beauty. 3 chairs in the front row, marked with crisp white cards: mother of the bride, father of the bride, sister. I walked down to the garden before anyone else. The morning light filtered through the branches like gold dust, and I touched the back of one empty chair. The air felt both sharp and forgiving. Lydia appeared beside me. They're missing the best part, she said. They've been missing it my whole life, I replied quietly. By mid-morning, the cottage hummed with soft music and the faint rustle of dresses. I sat still while Lydia pinned my hair, twisting strands into a loose knot adorned with a few white pearls. No makeup artist, no stylists, no bustle of champagne and gossip, just her and me. Do you regret calling them? She asked gently. I shook my head. No, I needed to give them the chance to show up. Now I know they chose not to. The clock struck noon and I heard footsteps outside. Lydia peered through the window. Someone's here, she said, surprised. But it's not your parents. When I stepped out, I froze. Standing at the gate was a man in a charcoal suit, hair gray, smile, hesitant but familiar. Uncle Henry, he nodded, slightly out of breath. I know I wasn't invited, he said, but when your father told me he wasn't coming, I thought, someone should. I hadn't seen my father's younger brother in nearly a decade. He was the black sheep of the family, the one who left Charleston to open a small bookshop in Savannah, dismissed by my mother as unambitious. But he was the one who had taught me to ride a bike, who once whispered, "You don't need to earn love, kid. You just need to give it." Tears pricked my eyes. You came all this way, I took the first train I could, he said, smiling softly. If the offer still stands, I'd be honored to walk you down that aisle. My throat tightened, but I managed to nod. I'd love that. When the music began, just a violin played by one of Lydia's friends, the guests turned in their seats. The garden shimmered under a soft veil of sunlight, and for a moment the world felt kind again. I took Uncle Henry's arm, and together we stepped onto the path, lined with petals. Each step felt like shedding an old skin. I saw Luke waiting beneath the pergola, his navy suit, catching the light, his expression calm and radiant. Behind him stood only a handful of people, friends, co-workers, a few of his clients' faces filled with warmth. People who had chosen to be here, not out of duty or name, but because they cared. The violin swelled. The wind stirred. When I reached Luke, Uncle Henry placed my hand in his and said softly, "Take good care of her." "With everything I have," Luke promised. The ceremony itself was small, but it felt infinite. The officiant, a retired schoolteacher who had known me since childhood, spoke of resilience and choosing love over legacy. When it was time for vows, Luke took my hands and looked into my eyes with a steadiness that made the world fall silent. "I promise to love you not just for who you are today, but for every version of you that will grow from here," he said. "I promise to speak kindly, to hold gently, to build instead of break." I swallowed hard before answering. "I promise to walk beside you even when the road feels long. I promise to see you not as what you do, but as who you are. I promise that our home will never demand perfection, only honesty." When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, there were cheers, small but bright. The air smelled of rain on petals and sunlight spilled across Luke's shoulders. He kissed me gentle and certain, and for the first time in my life I didn't care who was watching or who wasn't. After the ceremony, Lydia snapped a photo of us beneath the oak tree. My head rested against Luke's chest. His hand brushed a strand of hair from my face. Behind us, the 3 empty chairs gleamed in the afternoon light, their absence no longer heavy but liberating. Later, as we cut the modest cake, Lydia had baked herself. Laughter filled the garden. Someone turned on soft music, and Luke reached for my hand. "Dance with me," he said. I laughed. "We don't even have a dance floor." He smiled. "Sure we do. Right here." Barefoot on the grass, we swayed to a tune only we could hear. The guests clapped, someone whistled, and Uncle Henry raised a glass. "To love that needs no audience," he said. We all toasted. The champagne was cheap, the flowers slightly wilted, but everything about it was perfect. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in rose and amber, the photographer captured one last picture. Luke whispering something in my ear that made me laugh, a golden glow behind us. "I have a surprise for you," he said. I looked up. "What kind of surprise?" "The kind that proves your family was wrong." His eyes sparkled with mischief, but he said no more. We spent the rest of the evening surrounded by laughter, clinking glasses, and music drifting through the trees. It wasn't the kind of wedding that would appear in a magazine, but it was ours, every imperfect, extraordinary second of it. As the last guests left, I stood alone in the garden, watching the candles flicker in their jars. The 3 empty chairs were still there, but they no longer looked abandoned. They looked finished, like the final lines of a story I'd already outgrown. Luke came up behind me, slipped his arms around my waist, and rested his chin on my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "More than okay. For the first time I feel like I belong somewhere." He kissed the side of my head. "You always did. You just had to stop asking permission." I turned to face him. The string lights glowed above us, and the air was soft with the scent of flowers and earth. I whispered, "Thank you for showing up." He smiled. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world." We walked back toward the cottage, hand in hand, the night settling gently around us. Behind us, the garden remained quiet, the 3 chairs glowing faintly under the fading light. I didn't know then that those empty chairs would one day be filled not by the people who abandoned me, but by those who came after, who understood that love doesn't ask for invitation cards or family approval. It just asks to be seen. And as the stars appeared over Charleston, I knew I was finally seen by the only person who ever truly looked. 2 months after the wedding, the days began to fall into a quiet rhythm. The mornings smelled of coffee and river, wined the evenings of lemon soap and rain. Our apartment wasn't large, just a single-floor loft near the Cooper River, but every creak of the wood and drip of the faucet felt like home. Luke worked long hours, often returning with his sleeves rolled and his hair damp from a day spent fixing leaks around the city. I spent mine balancing spreadsheets at the firm, finding small moments of joy in coming home to the sound of his humming from the kitchen. We didn't have chandeliers or fine china, but we had peace, and for me that was wealth enough. One Saturday, rain began before dawn and didn't stop. The sound filled the apartment like static, steady and soothing. Luke left early to check a flooded basement for one of his clients. I stayed behind, tidying, humming to myself as I folded laundry and stacked dishes. By mid-afternoon, the rain had softened to a mist. I went to his study, a small corner room with an old wooden desk, to look for a charger cord. He always kept things neatly arranged, tools in Rose notebooks stacked perfectly. When I opened the bottom drawer, something caught my eye, a leather folder, dark brown, its edges worn smooth. I hesitated. It wasn't locked, just tucked away, almost hidden. I told myself I was only curious, that married couples shouldn't keep secrets, that it wasn't really snooping if it was just a glance. My hand shook anyway as I lifted the flap. Inside was a diploma. Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Bachelor of Science in Mechanical and Electrical Engineering. Name Luke E. Harris. I blinked. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a client's. Maybe his father's. But underneath were more documents, patent applications, stamped with federal seals, technical blueprints, filled with equations and water flow diagrams. One folder read Hydronet Smart Grid Phase 3 Testing. At the bottom, printed names I recognized from financial news, venture capital firms, corporate engineers. My breath caught. Luke wasn't just a plumber. He was an engineer, maybe even an inventor. I sank into his chair, the papers trembling in my hands. I'd spent months defending him to my family, swearing that titles didn't matter, that worth wasn't measured by degrees or salaries. And now I realized he had all of those things and had chosen to hide them. Was it pride, shame, or something else? I set the documents down carefully and stared at the rain streaking across the window. My reflection stared back, pale and unsure. I thought about every quiet answer he'd ever given when people asked what he did. "I fix leaks," he'd say with a smile, and I'd think it was humility. But maybe it was protection. Or maybe I didn't know him at all. When I heard the door open an hour later, I was still sitting there. Luke stepped in, shaking off his jacket hair damp. He looked at the desk, at the folder laid open. His smile faded. "I guess I owe you an explanation," he said quietly. I didn't speak. The silence between us stretched like a thin wire ready to snap. He pulled out a chair and sat across from me. "I worked for a defense contractor outside D.C. After college," he began. "High clearance projects. Good money. Long nights. I was an engineer, sure, but I hated the politics. Every decision was made for profit, not people." He paused, eyes lowering to his hands. "Then my dad had a heart attack. I came home to help with the plumbing business just for 6 months. But when I got here, I saw how much I'd missed. Real work, real people. So I stayed." I looked down at the patents. "And these," he smiled faintly. "Hydronet. A system I started designing years ago. It uses smart grids to recycle and redistribute water more efficiently. I've been testing prototypes in local homes." Quietly, "You've been working on this all along." "Yes," he hesitated, then added, "I didn't tell you, because I wanted you to love me for the life I live, not the resume I left behind." I let out a shaky breath. "You think I wouldn't have?" He reached into the folder and pulled out an old email, sliding it across the desk. "There's another reason." The sender's name made my stomach tighten. Beatrice Whitmore, my mother. The subject line read, "Prospective candidates for Savannah Whitmore." The date was 2 years before Luke and I met. I scanned the message. Someone had suggested Luke for Savannah, MIT graduate, young, promising. My mother's response burned into me like acid. "Impressive on paper, but runs a plumbing business now. Not our kind of people." My vision blurred. "She knew you," I whispered. "She did," Luke said softly. "Your family had my name once. They passed." My laugh came out like a gasp. "So when I brought you to dinner, they didn't recognize me," he finished. Which told me everything I needed to know. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" He leaned forward, voice calm but heavy. "Because I wanted you to choose me for who I am now, not who they once might have approved of. I didn't want to live in their world, Ellie. I wanted to build ours." I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down until something inside me gave way, not with anger, but with awe. This man, the one they'd mocked, had chosen simplicity over spectacle, purpose over prestige. He'd walked away from everything my family worshipped. I reached across the table, touching his hand. "You didn't have to hide it to prove you were enough." He smiled faintly. Maybe I needed to remind myself that I was. The rain outside had stopped, replaced by the distant roll of thunder fading toward the sea. The room felt lighter, somehow like a storm had passed through and left only clean air behind. Luke stood, gathering the papers back into their folder. "Your mother once said I wasn't their kind of people," he said. "And she was right. I'm not, but that's the best thing I ever heard." I laughed softly through the tears. "You know she'll never admit she was wrong." He looked at me, eyes warm. "Then she'll have to live with it. Because the world's about to find out anyway." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, the hint of a grin touching his mouth. "Let's just say Hydronet's about to go public, press interviews, summit presentations, the whole deal. They'll see my name soon enough." I shook my head, half amazed, half terrified. "You're serious?" He came around the table and wrapped his arms around me. "Serious enough to finally stop hiding." I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The same sound that had calmed me during storms now echoed with something new purpose. That night after he fell asleep, I sat by the window, watching the reflection of our small apartment shimmer against the glass. I thought of my parents, of the grand hallways that echoed with pride and emptiness, and of the man asleep beside me who built something real from the simplest tools. The world had called him a plumber. They had no idea he was rebuilding what they had lost, the kind of worth that doesn't need an audience. I touched the folder once more before sliding it back into the drawer. Some secrets weren't meant to divide, they were meant to reveal. As I turned off the light, Luke murmured in his sleep, his hand reaching for mine. I smiled into the darkness. He had said, "They'll know about me one day." I didn't understand what he meant then, but soon the entire country would. 3 months after I found the folder, life had settled into a strange kind of calm, the quiet, before something big enough to change the air itself. Luke spent most of his time in his workshop soldering pieces of tubing and fine-tuning sensors while I learned to recognize the hum of his mind at work. He would come home with hands covered in graphite and a smile that looked like he'd been somewhere sacred. We were happy in that small, steady way people are when they stop waiting for permission. Then one morning over breakfast, he mentioned it casually, as if it were nothing. "They invited me to speak at the Urban Sustainability Summit in Washington," he said, stirring his coffee. "The one sponsored by the Federal Energy Commission?" I asked. He nodded, eyes gleaming just a little. "They want me to present HydroNet on the main stage." I stared at him, unable to hide my grin. "Luke, that's incredible. That's national coverage." He smiled but shrugged, pretending to downplay it. "It's just a conference. A few city planners and environmental engineers. Don't make a big deal out of it." But the light in his eyes betrayed him. The week leading up to the trip, the house buzzed with quiet energy. He polished his shoes, ironed the suit he rarely wore, practiced his opening lines in front of the mirror. One night I caught him looking at me through the reflection. "You're nervous," I teased. "Not about the presentation," he said. "About what happens after." I didn't understand then, but I nodded anyway. On the morning of the summit, I watched him tie his navy tie and slip on his jacket. The fabric stretched across his shoulders perfectly. "You look—" I hesitated, searching for the right word. "Like the man I knew you were the moment I met you." He smiled softly. "Keep your phone nearby, all right." "Why?" He kissed my forehead. "Because I think you'll want to see this one live." After he left, the apartment felt both too quiet and too charged, as if it were holding its breath. I turned on the TV for company while sorting through emails, letting the hum of daytime news fill the silence. At 2 in the afternoon, the anchor's voice shifted to a tone of excitement. "Coming up next," she said, an inspiring story of innovation, a former NASA engineer turned plumber who's revolutionizing America's water systems. My hands froze. I dropped my pen. The screen flashed to a live broadcast. The caption read, "Urban Sustainability Summit HydroNet Systems Presentation." And there he was standing at a podium, sleeves crisp, tie knotted neatly, posture confident but humble. Behind him glowed the logo he had drawn by hand at our kitchen table. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and warm. "I grew up watching my father fix broken pipes in homes most people had forgotten. He used to say, 'You can't stop water from finding its path, you can only guide it.' I built HydroNet to do the same, guide our resources, not fight them." The camera panned across the audience, rows of senators, CEOs, journalists scribbling notes. "This system," Luke continued, "can cut residential water waste by 60%. But it's not just about conservation. It's about dignity. Infrastructure is the language of care. When you maintain what people live with every day, you remind them they matter." Applause broke out, slow at first, then swelling like a wave. He smiled, that quiet smile. I loved the one that always came before he said something that would stay with you forever. "What we fix," he said, "isn't just plumbing. It's trust." My throat tightened. I felt something inside me shift like a knot unraveling after years of tension. I didn't move for the rest of the segment. When it ended, the anchor returned to the screen, her expression glowing. And behind every innovator, she said, is often a story of love and perseverance. Luke Harris, founder of Hydronet Systems, credits his wife Eleanor with helping him stay grounded. The couple's simple backyard wedding last fall has since gone viral online, praised for its message of humility and heart. A photo filled the screen, me in my lace gown, Luke, brushing a leaf from my hair, the golden light of the garden spilling behind us. The caption read, "Love over legacy, the couple who redefined success." I stared frozen as the image faded. Then my phone began to ring. 1 call, 2, 10, 20, the numbers blurred together. Mother, father, Savannah, Whitmore Estate. Private number. By the time the screen stopped flashing, the count at the bottom read 110 missed calls. I let the phone buzz once more before silencing it. The quiet afterward felt almost holy. When Luke came home that night, he found me sitting on the couch, with the TV still playing muted coverage of the summit. He loosened his tie, glanced at the phone on the table, and raised an eyebrow. "They saw it, didn't they?" I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. "All of it." He smiled slightly, crossing the room to sit beside me. "How many calls?" 110, I said. "Funny," he murmured. "That's about how many family dinners they skipped while you were growing up." I laughed, soft, startled, almost a sob. "You shouldn't make me laugh right now." He took my hand, thumb brushing over my palm. "You deserve to laugh, Ellie. Especially now." We sat there in silence, the kind that doesn't need words. Through the window, the city glowed against the dark sky, and the river reflected streaks of gold and blue. I imagined my parents sitting in that mansion, watching the same broadcast, realizing too late what they had thrown away. For years they had called me a disappointment. Now the man they mocked was on national television, speaking to a country that listened. That night, messages flooded my inbox, strangers from around the world sharing words like inspired, hopeful, finally, someone real. Articles popped up online from Wrench to Wonder, the plumber who changed America's water future. Hashtags trended: number, love over legacy, number, Eleanor and Luke, number, Hydronet. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same society my parents tried so hard to impress now admired the one man they had dismissed. When I finally turned off the TV, Luke had fallen asleep beside me, his hand still holding mine. I looked at him, at the calm on his face, and thought about everything that had led us here. The humiliation, the judgment, the empty chairs at our wedding. Somehow every scar had built this moment. I got up, walked to the window, and opened it just enough to feel the breeze. The air smelled of rain and river salt. The street below was quiet, except for the faint echo of a news anchor's voice from a nearby apartment. The Harris couple's story has touched millions. I smiled, resting my head against the frame. For the first time in my life, silence didn't feel like defeat. It felt like victory. Behind me, Luke stirred and said, half asleep, "You okay?" "Yes," I whispered. "I'm perfect." He reached out his hand without opening his eyes, and I slid mine into his. The city lights flickered across his face like a promise. For years I had believed that love meant obedience, that dignity required approval. But watching him that day, standing on that stage, unashamed of his past and unapologetic about his worth, I understood something I never had before. Revenge didn't have to roar. Sometimes it simply rose. As I turned off the lamp, the last thing I saw was our reflection in the dark window. His head on my shoulder, my fingers intertwined with his, and the faint glow of my silent phone still lined with unanswered calls. The world had finally seen him. And through him, they had seen me too. Sunday morning sunlight poured through the windows, soft and gold, catching the steam from Luke's coffee. I was still in my robe, barefoot, reading the newspaper when the knock came. It was sharp, deliberate, the kind that didn't wait to be invited. Luke looked up from his mug, eyebrows raised. "Expecting anyone?" "No," I said, but a feeling crept over me, something between dread and inevitability. When I opened the door, the breath caught in my chest. There they were, my parents, my sister, standing on the porch like actors waiting for applause. My mother was immaculate, as always, hair perfectly coiffed, pearls shining under her silk blouse. My father held a basket of imported wine and cheese, the label facing forward. Savannah lingered behind them, oversized sunglasses masking her eyes. "Eleanor, my mother," said her voice, sticky sweet. "We thought it was time we paid you and Luke a visit." For a moment the world went still. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator behind me. Then I stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "Come in." The apartment was modest but warm, the scent of coffee and cinnamon drifting through the air, sunlight pooling across our old wooden table. My mother glanced around with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How quaint," she said. Luke stood in the kitchen doorway, calm as ever, sleeves rolled up, mug still in hand. "Morning," he said evenly. "Luke, my father," replied his voice, forced jovial. "Quite the celebrity now, aren't you?" That summit was impressive. We watched it on CNN. Couldn't believe my ears. My mother chimed in before Luke could answer. "It's remarkable. Truly. We had no idea you were doing such important work." Luke smiled faintly. "Neither did you, apparently." Her laugh was thin and brittle. "Well, we all make mistakes." Savannah spoke next, sliding off her glasses. "That wedding photo of you two, it's everywhere. People are calling it the most authentic thing they've seen in years. I have to admit I underestimated it." "You underestimated me," I said quietly. She blinked but didn't argue. My mother clasped her hands. "Eleanor, darling, I think it's time we put all this unpleasantness behind us. Family is family after all." I crossed my arms. Family is supposed to show up before the cameras do. A shadow flickered across her face, gone as quickly as it came. "Don't be cruel," she said. "We came here to make peace." Luke set down his mug. "Peace or partnership?" My father straightened, clearing his throat. "You misunderstand. I simply thought, given your newfound success, there might be ways we could work together. Whitmore Development is launching a new line of eco-friendly properties. Your hydronet systems could fit perfectly." I stared at him, disbelief curling through my chest. "You disowned me for marrying a plumber, and now you want him to install your conscience, Eleanor," he said sharply. "There's no need for hostility. There's no need for hypocrisy either," Luke added gently. My mother smoothed her blouse, pretending not to hear. "Let's not ruin this. We're offering an opportunity. A collaboration that would benefit everyone." Luke looked at her, his tone still even but unyielding. "Mrs. Whitmore, we don't collaborate with people who measure worth by headlines. Hydronet was built on trust, not image." Savannah shifted uncomfortably, looking between us. "You're being unfair," she said to me. "They're trying to what I asked? Reclaim their reputation. You didn't come here to reconnect. You came to profit." The room fell silent. Outside, a car door slammed somewhere in the street, the sound distant and hollow. My father finally spoke, his voice low. "If that's how you feel, then I suppose there's no point in continuing." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope. "There's one more thing." I took it, unfolded the paper inside, and read the words that sealed the truth of the visit. "A voluntary withdrawal from all Whitmore trusts and estates, effective immediately." The justification printed below: "to preserve brand integrity in light of recent associations." I looked up at him, the paper trembling between my fingers. "You're serious?" He nodded. "This way there's no confusion. You and Luke can continue your journey free from any ties to us." My mother spoke softly, almost soothingly. "It's for the best, darling. Clean boundaries." Luke stood beside me, quiet but steady. I could feel the heat of his presence even without looking at him. "Do you have a pen?" I asked. My father blinked. "You don't even want to think about it." "There's nothing to think about," I said. I signed my name at the bottom of the document with a calm I didn't know I had. When I handed it back, my voice didn't shake. "Now we're free." My mother's mask slipped for a fraction of a second. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said. "You disowned me when it was convenient. This just makes it official." Luke's hand found mine solid and sure. "You should go," he said quietly. My father's mouth tightened. "You're making a mistake." I smiled. "So did you." Savannah lingered at the door as they turned to leave. Her voice was soft. "I didn't know they'd go this far." "Yes, you did," I said, but without anger. "You just didn't want to see it." Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing more. When the door closed behind them, the apartment went still. Luke exhaled long and slow. I stared at the envelope on the table at my name, written in blue ink, final, irreversible. He reached for a mug, poured me coffee, and handed it to me. "You okay?" I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warmth. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Actually, I think I am." We sat down together at the table, sunlight spilling across the papers. He brushed his thumb along my wrist. "That was the moment, wasn't it?" he said. "What moment? The one where you stopped asking them to love you." The truth of it hit deep. I leaned back, letting the silence fill the space where pain used to live. Outside, the city hummed on, unconcerned, alive, moving forward. "They'll tell everyone I walked away," I said after a while. "Let them," Luke replied. "They'll never admit they were already gone." I laughed softly, the sound surprising me. "You always know what to say." He smiled. "Only because I've been there. Letting go looks impossible until you do it. Then you realize your hands were never full, just holding on to the wrong things." We spent the rest of the morning in quiet, sipping coffee, watching the light shift across the floor. I thought about the house I grew up in, the cold marble floors, the endless rules. I thought about the 3 empty chairs at our wedding and how they no longer haunted me. For years I had believed freedom meant approval, that I could only stand tall once they finally said I was enough. But, standing in that room, signing away everything they'd ever used to define me, I realized something else. Freedom isn't something you're given. It's something you choose. As the day faded into afternoon, Luke leaned across the table and kissed my forehead. "You did it," he whispered. "I guess I did." I glanced toward the door, imagining them driving away, the echoes of their pride dissolving in the distance. My heart felt light, unburdened. "They came here to reclaim their name," I said. "But all they did was return my peace." Luke smiled, his eyes soft and certain. "That's the best kind of revenge." And for the first time in my life, I believed him. The first headline appeared on a Wednesday morning, tucked into the business section like a whisper, trying to hide from its own echo. "State opens inquiry into Whitmore Enterprises financial irregularities alleged." I read it twice, then a third time, just to be sure I wasn't imagining it. The words felt surreal, cold, distant, but strangely poetic. After years of pretending their world was untouchable, the cracks were finally visible. Luke came up behind me, reading over my shoulder. "It was bound to happen," he said quietly. I folded the paper, setting it down beside my coffee. "Do you think it's true?" He hesitated. "It usually is." By evening, the whisper had become thunder. Every news channel had picked up the story. Whitmore Shipping and Development accused of using offshore accounts for tax avoidance. Reporters stood outside the Charleston courthouse, their voices sharp against the backdrop of flashbulbs. My father's name scrolled across the bottom of the screen, followed by my mother's charity foundation, now under review. I watched from the couch, expression unreadable. Luke muted the TV. "You don't have to see this," he said. But I shook my head. "No, I need to. I need to know what truth sounds like when it finally speaks." Over the next week, the scandal spread like wildfire. Old colleagues distanced themselves. Sponsors pulled out of my mother's fundraisers. Socialites who once filled her galas with laughter suddenly developed scheduling conflicts. The empire that had always seemed too pristine to touch was unraveling thread by thread. At the office, I overheard whispers from coworkers who didn't realize I was behind them. "Did you hear about the Whitmores? You'd never guess someone like her came from that family." They meant it kindly, but the words still stung. That night I came home to find Luke cooking dinner, sleeves rolled up, humming under his breath. I leaned against the counter watching him. "They're losing everything," I said. He set down the spatula, turned to face me. "You're not responsible for their choices, Ellie." "I know. It's just..." I hesitated. I thought when this day came I'd feel happy. Vindicated, maybe. But all I feel is tired. Luke smiled gently. That's peace sneaking in. You're just not used to it yet. Days turned into weeks. The headlines grew darker. Charity audit reveals misused funds. Whitmore Development faces multiple lawsuits. Family estate under review for foreclosure. The same magazines that once called them pillars of Southern grace now printed words like disgraced, corrupt, and fallen. One evening I sat on our balcony watching the sunset fade over the river. My phone buzzed with a message from Savannah. I don't know where else to go. No hello, no apology, just that. I stared at the screen for a long moment before locking it and setting it aside. The truth was, I didn't owe her a rescue. Still, I thought of her, of the parties, the dresses, the smug confidence that had once made her seem untouchable. I pictured her now watching their house turn from palace to prison. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. Only a quiet ache for the girl she'd once been before our mother taught her that beauty was a shield and love a weapon. By the end of the month, my parents' names had disappeared from every charity board they once ruled. The Whitmore crest was removed from the old courthouse they'd sponsored. Their mansion, Whitmore Hall, was photographed behind caution tape as investigators filed in. That image hit me harder than I expected, not out of sorrow but out of recognition. I remembered the sound of my shoes on those marble floors, the smell of lilies, and polished the silence that had lived between every perfect dinner conversation. I had always thought that house would outlast everything, but marble can't hold lies forever. Luke found me staring at the photograph online. You should close that, he said softly. I can't, I whispered. It's strange. I spent half my life trying to be seen in that place, and now it's finally visible for what it is, a museum of pretense. He came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. Then let it fall, he said. You built something better. A few days later, I received a letter from my family's old attorney. It was official documentation, my name formally removed from all Whitmore assets and trusts. Attached was a short note in my father's handwriting. We hope this brings closure. I smiled faintly. For once he's right. Luke read over my shoulder and laughed softly. Guess you finally fixed the last leak. That night I lay awake listening to the rain tap against the windows. The sound reminded me of Luke's first day in my apartment, the burst pipe, the chaos, the man who showed up and quietly set things right. The irony wasn't lost on me. My father had spent decades building an empire that collapsed under its own pride, while Luke, the man they mocked, had built something stronger, something that flowed instead of cracked. A week later, a storm rolled through Charleston. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the silhouette of Whitmore Hall on the distant hill. I imagined the storm tearing through those grand halls, wind howling through the empty corridors, rain seeping into the marble floors that had once reflected chandeliers. In the morning I drove past the estate on my way to work. The gates were locked, a for sale sign hanging crookedly against the iron bars. The once pristine garden was overgrown, the fountain dry. It looked smaller than I remembered, like a photograph someone had left in the rain too long. When I returned home, Luke was sitting on the porch reading. I joined him, curling my legs beneath me. They're selling the house, I said. He looked up, meeting my eyes. Does it hurt? I thought for a moment. It used to be where everything started. Now it feels like where everything ended. He reached out, lacing his fingers with mine. Then you can stop looking back. For a long while, we just sat there watching the light fade over the river. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled like thunder. Finally, I spoke. I used to think revenge was loud, a grand gesture, a public victory. But this silence feels louder. Luke smiled, brushing his thumb over my hand. That's because it's not revenge anymore. It's freedom. I leaned my head against his shoulder, the world softening around us. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and magnolia. Somewhere, a distant bell chimed the hour. In the distance, Whitmore Hall stood dark and empty, its windows, hollow eyes staring into nothing. But for once, I didn't feel haunted by it. They built a name, I murmured, and lost themselves inside it. And you, Luke asked? I built a life, I said, and that's the better investment. He laughed quietly, pulling me closer. Spoken like a true Whitmore turned Harris. I smiled. No, just Harris. The sun dipped below the horizon, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel the weight of my past pressing against my chest. There was no need for triumph or pity, no score to settle. Justice had already arrived softly, quietly, in the form of peace. And as the river shimmered under the last light of day, I realized that the truest kind of revenge was this walking away and never needing to look back. The phone rang just after midnight, shattering the kind of sleep that only comes after peace. I fumbled in the dark until I saw the screen glow. Savannah. For a moment I considered letting it ring, but something in me, a mixture of curiosity and old unburied instinct, made me swipe to answer. Her voice cracked through the line, barely coherent. Ellie, I didn't know who else to call. I sat up, heart pounding. What happened? It's Parker, she stammered. The FBI showed up this morning. They froze our accounts. He's being indicted for securities fraud. I don't even know what's real anymore. I rubbed my forehead, trying to keep my voice steady. Savannah, slow down. They took everything, she whispered. The cars, the apartment. He's facing years in prison. I went to Mom and Dad, they won't even let me stay at the lake house. Said it's too risky, too much press. I have nowhere to go. The words hit like distant thunder, a storm I'd long seen coming. I closed my eyes. You can come here, I said quietly. There was a pause, then a small broken sob. Thank you. By the time she arrived the next morning, the sky was gray and heavy with fog. She stepped out of a cab wearing oversized sunglasses and clutching a single suitcase. Her hair was unbrushed, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't think you'd open the door. I did once, I said softly. Might as well keep the habit. She smiled weakly, stepping inside. The apartment felt different with her there, like two worlds colliding in a space too small for both. She set her bag down, her perfume faint but familiar, the scent of a life that no longer existed. Thank you, she said again. I need somewhere to think. You can stay as long as you need, I said. The guest room's ready. For the first 2 days she barely spoke. She wandered the apartment quietly like a ghost, trying to remember what being human felt like. Luke, ever gracious, treated her kindly, asking nothing and offering tea she rarely finished. She slept late, woke early, paced the balcony at night. I didn't push. I knew the rhythm of collapse too well. On the third evening, I found her in the kitchen, staring at the kettle as if it held answers. I can't believe this is my life, she murmured. One minute I was planning a trip to Capri, and the next I'm Googling how to break a lease. I leaned against the counter. Sometimes life doesn't fall apart. It's just showing you what was already broken. She gave a shaky laugh. You sound like him. Like who, Luke? She said softly. He's kind. Too kind. I don't know how you ended up with that after growing up with them. I smiled faintly. Maybe kindness was rebellion. That night she joined us for dinner. She even laughed once at something Luke said about a pipe bursting in a senator's mansion. For a moment, she looked like my sister again, the one I used to braid hair with before the world taught her to weaponize charm. But peace, I've learned, doesn't stay long when it's borrowed. 2 days later, I came home early from work and heard her voice through the cracked door of the guest room. Her tone was hushed but firm. Yes, Mother, I'm here. No, she doesn't suspect anything. He's incredible, calm, respected. If Luke vouches for me, publicly people will forget all this. His reputation could fix everything. I just need more time. The air left my lungs. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just stood there, heart pounding. My mother's voice murmured faintly through the phone, too low to make out, but I didn't need to hear the words. I knew the pattern, the manipulation, the performance, the old family choreography. I stepped back before she could see me retreating to the kitchen where the kettle still sat cold on the stove. I didn't cry. I just felt tired. So tired of history repeating itself in prettier clothes. That evening after dinner, Luke went out to return a work call. I walked to the guest room where Savannah sat cross-legged on the bed, scrolling through her phone. She looked up smiling. "Hey, how long were you planning to pretend?" I asked. Her smile faltered. "What I heard you on the phone," I said calmly. "You told Mom you'd use Luke to fix your image. You said I didn't suspect anything." Her face went pale. "Ellie, it's not what you think." I crossed my arms. "Then tell me what it is." She opened her mouth, closed it again, and then whispered. I just panicked. "Everything's gone. People are saying horrible things. I thought if I could get Luke to say something nice about me, maybe the press would stop." "Stop what I said." Telling the truth, tears filled her eyes. "I didn't mean to hurt you. You just what I said softly. Did what Mom taught us." Smile twists survive. She broke then. The tears came fast. "Ugly real. I don't even know who I am anymore," she sobbed. "When Parker was arrested, I didn't cry for him. I cried because of how it made me look. That's who I've become." I sat down beside her, the anger dissolving into something else. "Then that's where you start," I said quietly. She looked at me through smeared mascara. "Why are you still being kind after everything I said to you after I laughed at your wedding? How can you even stand to look at me?" "Because I know what it feels like to be you," I said. "To chase approval until you forget your own reflection." For a long while, we sat in silence. The city lights flickered through the blinds, painting stripes across the room. When she finally spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Do you think there's a way back?" "There's always a way back," I said. "But it starts with telling the truth, even when it costs you everything." The next morning, she was gone before sunrise, leaving a note on the kitchen counter. "I'm going to try. For once, really try." Weeks passed. She found a job at a small coffee shop near the marina. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. I visited her one afternoon just to see. She was behind the counter, hair tied back, wiping down tables with quiet focus. When she saw me, her face softened into a shy smile. "It's not much," she said. "It's honest," I replied. "That's more than you ever got from home." She looked down, biting her lip. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I shook my head. "You did that yourself." That night I told Luke about the visit. He smiled, stirring his tea. "People change when they get tired of their own reflection," he said. "Maybe she's finally seeing herself clearly." I nodded, watching the steam curl between us. Maybe. Later, as I stood by the window looking out at the quiet river, I realized something. I hadn't forgiven her because she deserved it. I'd forgiven her because I needed to stop carrying the weight of being right. Sometimes mercy isn't weakness, it's survival. When I went to bed, Luke reached for my hand under the covers. "You okay?" he murmured. "Yes," I said softly. "For the first time, I think I really am." And in the dark, I thought of my sister wiping tables at dawn, her back straight, her hands steady, her heart learning how to start over. Maybe the truest revenge wasn't destruction. Maybe it was rebuilding and doing it differently. The morning paper lay folded on the porch, half soaked from the mist. I bent down to pick it up and froze at the headline printed across the front page: "Whitmore Enterprises files for bankruptcy." The photo beneath showed my father walking out of a courthouse, head lowered, jaw clenched. Beside him, my mother's once perfect posture seemed smaller, her face half hidden behind dark glasses. For a long moment, I just stood there in the quiet, watching the ink blur under the damp. Luke opened the door behind me, coffee in hand. "It finally happened," he said. I nodded, voice low. "I thought I'd feel something, anger, satisfaction, but I don't." He stepped closer, offering the mug. "That's not emptiness, that's peace." I sipped the coffee, the warmth spreading through my chest. "I used to think they were indestructible." He smiled faintly. "Everyone thinks their parents are gods until the truth shows otherwise." The truth had shown itself loudly. The investigation had uncovered everything. Fraudulent transfers, false charity reports, luxury assets hidden under shell companies. The house in Greenwich, the beach property in Hilton Head, the private accounts in Zurich, all gone or frozen. The once untouchable Whitmores were now the talk of the city for reasons they could never spin as elegant. I turned on the news briefly, just long enough to see the footage of reporters shouting questions as my mother slipped into a waiting car. The anchor's voice was measured but merciless. After years of portraying themselves as philanthropists, the Whitmores face a mountain of debt and federal charges that could lead to prison time. I turned it off. They spent decades chasing respectability, I murmured. Now all they've earned is pity. That afternoon, I drove into the city to visit Savannah. Her shift at the cafe was almost over when I arrived. Through the window, I watched her clearing tables, her movements steady-focused. She wore a plain gray apron over her jeans, her hair tied back neatly. There was no trace of the glamorous woman who once bragged about yachts and galas. When she saw me, her eyes widened, then softened. "Hey," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "I didn't expect you today." "Thought I'd check in," I said, sitting at the counter. She poured me a cup of coffee. "It's on the house," she joked, then added quieter. "Technically, I am the house." I smiled. "How's it going?" "It's honest work," she said, shrugging. "Customers get cranky, my feet hurt, but I sleep through the night for the first time in years. That sounds like freedom." She nodded, eyes thoughtful. "You know what's funny? I used to think working hard meant you'd failed somewhere. Now it feels like the first thing I've ever done that's real." A silence stretched between us, soft but full. Then she reached into her pocket and handed me an envelope. "Mom wrote again. She sent it to me this time. Said maybe you'd read it if it came through me." I hesitated before opening it. Inside, on expensive stationery with fading gold trim, were the familiar practiced loops of my mother's handwriting. "Eleanor," it began. "Despite everything, you will always be a Whitmore. The past is complicated, but family is family. We'd like to invite you and Luke to a small dinner at the club to rebuild, to remind the world that appearances can heal what words cannot." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Even now she thinks image can fix the truth." Savannah sighed. "She hasn't changed." "No," I said. "But I have." I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. "You can tell her I'm not coming." Savannah smiled, something like relief crossing her face. "I thought you'd say that." We talked a little longer about her new apartment, about the customers who tipped in stories, instead of money, about small beginnings that felt big anyway. When I left, the sun had dipped low, turning the city gold. For the first time, I didn't see her as the mirror of everything I'd tried to escape. She was just my sister, flawed human learning. Driving home, I passed the old Whitmore mansion. The once grand gates were locked, a for sale sign leaning crooked against them. Weeds crept between the stones of the driveway. The fountain, where we used to take family portraits, was dry and cracked. Through one of the windows, I caught a glimpse of the ballroom chandelier, dim and dust-covered. The sight didn't make me sad. It made me grateful. That evening, Luke and I sat on the porch, the air cool and quiet. He read the newspaper while I watched the sun sink into the horizon. "Savannah's doing better," I said. He smiled. "You helped her." "She helped herself," I corrected. "I just opened the door." He folded the paper. "You know, I think your mother will always send those letters. It's her way of pretending she can still control the story." I looked at the sky. Then she can have her version. I'm done living in it. A week later, my father called. His voice was rougher, older. "Your mother's not well," he said. "Stress, the doctors think. She's resting." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said quietly. He hesitated. I wanted to say, "I should have defended you that night you called about your wedding. I should have been better." "You still can be," I said. He exhaled. "I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not withholding it," I said. "It just isn't yours to ask for anymore." A long pause. Then he said softly, "You deserved better than us." "I know," I whispered, "but I got better." When the call ended, I sat for a while, staring at the phone in my hand. The ache that used to follow his voice didn't come. In its place was something gentler, quieter. That night, Savannah came by after her shift. We sat on the porch steps sharing leftover pie. The air smelled of salt and rain. "You heard about the bankruptcy?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah, they're selling the last property. The lake house. I guess it's really over." I took a bite of pie. Maybe it's just beginning for us anyway. She looked at me, eyes shining. "You forgave me when I didn't deserve it." "I didn't do it for you," I said softly. "I did it for me." "Forgiveness doesn't make you weak, Savannah. It makes you free." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "Then I hope one day I'm as free as you." "You will be," I said. "You're already halfway there." When she left, I stood for a long time watching her walk down the street, her silhouette steady under the streetlights. Later, as I climbed into bed, Luke reached for my hand. "You've been quiet," he murmured. "I'm thinking about how peace feels," I said. "It's strange. It doesn't announce itself. It just arrives." He smiled, half asleep. "Keep it. You earned it." Outside, the crickets sang, and the world felt balanced again, not perfect, just honest. I thought of the mansion, of the dry fountain, of my parents sitting somewhere in silence. I didn't hate them anymore. I didn't need to. I once believed revenge was the loudest justice. But as I watched Luke sleep beside me, the truth settled softly in my chest. Peace whispers louder. And that whisper was mine to keep. The late afternoon light spilled through the oak branches, warm and golden as laughter echoed across the backyard. Balloons bobbed in the breeze, ribbons tangled playfully in the fence, and the scent of vanilla cake drifted through the air. Our daughter Hazel was turning 2, and for the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about who wasn't there. Only about who was. Luke stood at the grill sleeves rolled up flipping burgers, while a small crowd of friends and neighbors chatted around the picnic table. Savannah helped string fairy lights across the pergola, her hair pulled into a messy ponytail, her hands dusted with flour from baking the cake herself. She was humming softly, something cheerful and light. I watched her for a moment and smiled. It had taken time, tears, and more humility than either of us had expected, but my sister had found her footing. She'd traded cocktail dresses for jeans, dinner galas for community work, and for the first time in her life she looked at peace. "Where do you want the presents?" she asked, carrying a pile of gift bags. "Anywhere Hazel can reach them," I said, laughing. "You know she thinks ribbons are more exciting than what's inside." Savannah grinned. "Then she's already smarter than I was at her age." The guests clapped as Hazel blew out her candles, with Luke's help frosting smudging across both of their cheeks. The sound was pure joy, unfiltered and free. I thought of the wedding aisle I'd walked alone years ago, of the silence where my family should have been, and realized that somehow life had filled those empty chairs with people who truly loved us. It was almost sunset when a car pulled up by the curb. A silver sedan, unfamiliar but careful, its engine humming low. The laughter softened. Savannah looked at me, her brow furrowing slightly. And then I saw them. My parents stepped out slowly, older now, shadows of the people they used to be. My father held a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. My mother clutched a children's book against her chest like it was something fragile. They paused by the gate, uncertain, searching my face for permission. Luke's hand found mine. He didn't speak, but his quiet nod told me everything. This was my choice. I walked to the edge of the yard, heart steady but strange. "You came," I said. My mother's voice was softer than I remembered. "We don't expect anything, Eleanor. We just wanted to bring something for Hazel. If that's all right." I looked at her, then at my father. Their posture, once rigid with pride, seemed smaller now, almost human. "She loves stories," I said finally. "You can read to her if you want." My mother smiled faintly, her eyes shining. My father handed me the box. "It's an old toy train," he said. "It was mine when I was her age." The sound of children laughing filled the space between us as I led them toward the porch. Hazel toddled over, curious, her curls bouncing. My mother knelt down awkwardly, smoothing her skirt, and opened the book. Her voice trembled a little as she began to read, but Hazel listened wide-eyed. My father sat beside them, his hand resting on the wooden train, the same way he used to rest his hand on the edge of his desk, when he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. No one spoke of the past. No apologies, no explanations. Just the quiet rhythm of a story being read aloud, a child's laughter floating through the air. Later, after the last guest had gone and the sky turned violet, I stood with my mother on the porch. She looked out at the yard, her face softened by twilight. "We lost everything," she said quietly. "But maybe what we lost wasn't what mattered." I didn't say anything for a while. Then I nodded. Maybe losing it was the only way to learn that. She turned to me, eyes glistening. "You've built something beautiful here, Eleanor. You and Luke. I'm proud of you." The words landed softly without the weight they once carried. "Thank you," I said. "But the truth is I don't need that anymore." She looked startled, then almost relieved. "I know," she whispered. When they left, there were no grand gestures, no tears. Just a quiet wave from the gate and a peace that lingered long after their car disappeared down the street. Inside, Savannah was washing dishes, humming to herself. Luke was tucking Hazel into bed, her tiny hand curled around his finger. I watched them from the doorway, my heart full, in a way it had never been before. Savannah dried her hands and joined me on the porch. "You handled that better than I could have," she said. "You're giving me too much credit," I replied. "I think time did most of the work." She laughed softly. "You know, when I started at the nonprofit, I thought it was just temporary. But I think I've found something I actually care about." "I'm proud of you," I said. She smiled. "See? That means something when it comes from you." The sun had long set by the time Luke came out, wrapping his arms around me from behind. The air smelled of grass and birthday cake. "She's asleep," he murmured. I leaned against him. "She'll have good dreams tonight." He nodded toward the porch light. "So will you." We sat together, the three of us, watching fireflies blink through the dark garden. My thoughts drifted back to that night years ago, standing alone in my wedding gown, walking the aisle without a hand to hold. Back then, I thought strength meant standing tall in silence. Now I understood it was about choosing peace over pride. "I used to think revenge was proving them wrong," I said quietly. "But it's really about proving to yourself that you were never wrong for being who you are." Luke kissed my temple. "You always were right, Ellie. You just needed to see it." I smiled, watching the stars flicker faintly above the trees. "They built a name," I said. "But we built a life. And in the end, that's what lasts." He squeezed my hand. "That's our legacy." Hazel's laughter echoed faintly from inside, the sweetest sound I'd ever known. I closed my eyes, breathing it in. This wasn't the story of a downfall or even of revenge. It was the story of becoming whole, of learning that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting and peace doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't to rise above your enemies, it's to stop living beneath their shadow. If you've ever been underestimated, abandoned, or told you weren't enough, I hope my story reminds you that your worth isn't up for debate. And if this story touched something in you, if you found strength in the quiet victories, the ones no one claps for, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear your story too. And if you believe, like I do, that good people still deserve good endings, that kindness can outlast cruelty, stay with us. Subscribe to this channel. There are more stories here. Stories that don't just move you, they remind you of who you really are. Because sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that echo the longest.